All right, this is week 5, lecture 4, and we're going to talk now a little bit about appreciative inquiry. And if you haven't read the whole book, I really want to encourage you to do so because this is a great resource that begins to help us explore the kind of change that maybe God would call us to make within the context that we're serving. So we recognize the power of vision, DNA, values, behavior, stories as it shapes a community. We also understand the power of the biblical story as it shapes and evokes a creative imagination within the life of a congregation. And last lecture, we talked about helping a church understand what its story is. Now, one of the things we want to do with appreciative inquiry, too often when a church begins to tell its story, it ends up negative all the time. What it's lacking, the scarcity, the brokenness. And we've got to confess those things. We've got to name those things. But we can't get mired in those things, or we continue to repeat the negativity or the stagnation or the lethargy that exists within the life of a congregation. What we've got to begin to do is help a church unearth or coax out the possibilities, the potential narratives of what could exist. And so appreciative inquiry is an intentional practice through which you as a leader would gather a team of people who are committed to seeing God move in transformative ways within the life of a community of faith and bring those people around a common shared goal or vision of helping the church envision and retell its story in a different way. And so you do this through a set of interviews. And so you sit with people intentionally, asking them questions about the story, but also really honing in and asking things like, where and when have you experienced God the most within the life of our community of faith? Where has God met you the most throughout the story of this congregation? What were the kinds of things that the congregation once did that you seem to believe made the biggest difference in the broader community? What are the gifts and graces that you feel like we have or who we are that we can really affect or impact a local community? That's called asset-based research within a community. You figure out what are the assets we have here, because every congregation is innately gifted. There's a gifting that's present within the life of a congregation, and most congregations simply need to be reminded there are gifts within it. So a powerful example of this, we tend to think in terms that the only churches that can really make broad difference are the big ones that are thriving, that are contemporary. But I'm not so sure that's sure, because every community has within it a set of gifts and graces. So there's a church that had a lot of senior adults, and a lot of these ladies, they quilted, they did needlework. They were just crafty. And so what they began to do is they began to come together and they began to quilt and crochet blankets and afghans for the police department. And what those policemen would do is they would keep those in the back of their cars so that when they had to go take a child out of a house, because there was some sort of domestic affair that was taking place in that house, that they would have a quilt or an afghan that they would be able to give that child that had been stitched in love and prayed over, that child could be wrapped in, and that child, in a sense, that could become their blankie in regards. And you think about that's such a small thing, but is it really it's a huge thing. It's an incredibly missional thing. And what they did is they began to explore that this is an asset. We have this within our congregation. We have this gift. We have this ability. We have this capacity. We recognize that domestic abuse is an issue in our community and that policemen are regularly responding to those. So how can we utilize our gifts and graces? We've ridden through the ruins. We've come to understand where the brokenness is in our community. How can we leverage the gifts and graces that we have in our church community, in our congregation, to impact and affect change within the broader community? So being able to identify what are the ruins, be able to identify the systemic brokenness that exists in a community, but then also coax out of them the ability to tell their story in a hopeful manner in which they recognize their capacity to affect and influence change through utilizing what already exists within the life of their congregation. So, for instance, there's congregations who they sit, and I think one of you was talking about it last night. You have a gymnasium there in a very difficult area, and you're utilizing that gymnasium for basketball. Now, yeah, can you get kids in to play basketball? Of course you can. But it's what you do with that time that they're playing basketball, the way in which you leverage relationships during that time. How can you engage them and utilize that space and time to affect change in the lives of the people? So you're not just having an event where people come in and play basketball. But this is an incredibly missional atmosphere in which you're seeking to build and establish relationships that ongoing can create a sense of mentorship, and that mentorship can foster change in the life of people outside the doors of your church. And so it's beginning to think through, okay, in our church of 50 or 70 or 100 or 200 that exists in this city, what do we have? As we look around, we can't affect change in everything, and we can't have an answer for every bit of systemic issue and brokenness out in our community. But what can we do? What has God equipped us with? And through the use of survey, through the use of collaborative conversation, in which you're coaching out of them. And when they want to go negative, you begin to say things. Yeah, I get that. We've talked about the brokenness that has existed in our church. But where do you see rays of hope? Where do you see God blossoming? Where do you see God bearing fruit? And you might be able to, and someone might say, well, we've got 3 elementary school teachers that work, or I mean, that come to our church. And they're really making a difference in their school. And then all of a sudden the light bulb may go off, and they may say, you know what, we've already got 3 elementary teachers in one school that are a part of our congregation. What would it look like if we adopted that school? What if we as a church, what if we made that our mission field, and we came alongside the school, and we took an offering every year that said we're going to help the teachers get the supplies they need, or we're going to have several of us that volunteer to read to the kids, and maybe even do after school mentorship. What are the things that we have the capacity to do? How can we elicit change and make a difference in the community that we find ourselves in? That's such an important conversation for churches to have. And I don't and what you're empowering them to do is to have that sense of self-discovery. We're not telling them what they need to do. Through our conversations and surveys, we're drawing that out of them, and then they're saying this is what we need to do. Because then they're fully participating in the move, in the shift, in the design and desire that God has for them. And then a lot of times they're the ones that's sparking, we're gonna start this ministry. I feel like God is calling me to be a part of that. And then it's not simply managed by a sense of a few pastors, but you as a pastor, as a missional change agent, are utilizing story and narrative to begin to give expression to the possibilities of change. So then God begins to give you a vision, and we're going to say, okay, we're going to adopt a school. Okay, that's the vision. Then what is the culture, the DNA? Well, we're going to have to be generous. We're going to have to make time and be available for those who are in the school who might need us. What are the values? Well, we're going to have to be safe, so we're going to do background checks. We're going to have to have a sense of hospitality, recognizing that not all of these kids will love that we're there or be nice or be kind, but that hospitality, us being able to create space. So what are the values? What are the shared practices? Well, we've got a group that goes in the morning to open the doors for the kids as they come in, or we have a group that goes in after school to read to the kids that are latchkey. Whatever those practices are. And then we begin in our services to tell the stories of what emerges out of that, and it begins to shape our congregation, and all of a sudden we find ourselves moving in a brand new way. And I think that is powerful, beautiful, and wonderful to begin to think about the possibilities of that. So this is this week's lectures, okay? And this is why I wanted, and we're going to talk a little bit more about appreciative inquiry and narrative over the next few weeks, especially as we begin to recognize the kind of postures that we're going to have as churches in our communities. But I wanted to spend some time. I wanted to spend about 40 or so minutes throughout these lectures talking about the power of understanding that you can't just go in and change a behavior. You've got to go down to the point of vision. How does a church want to see themselves within the broader community? You've got to address the kind of DNA that requires. You've got to explore the kind of values that are going to emerge out of that, and the behaviors that shape that, the narratives. Then we begin to talk about you've got to use Scripture well within the life of the congregation, because that's the tool, the vessel that the Holy Spirit uses to evoke creative imagination about engaging the world around us, because that's what God's story is. It's the story of God's mission in the world. And then we begin to explore about how do we help people understand their stories, because a lot of times our people aren't even unaware of the way in which they understand their own story, the story of the church, and the story of the broader community. And then how do we mine out hopeful stories, the kind of stories that give life and breath to a congregation as it engages the community for the sake of the kingdom. So that's a little bit about where we're going, what we've been talking about. And again, if you've not finished this book, please, you've got 2 weeks for the next book. Remember, all you have to do is pick either Faithful Present by Fitch or Sentness by Hammond and Crenshaw, and do that for not this weekend, but next weekend. So if you've yet to finish this, or if you didn't give it a good read, please, please, please do, because there's so much good stuff in here. And make sure, even listen, at this point, even if you've reflected upon it, you finish reading this, and you don't like your reflection, change it. I'll regrade it. But I really want you to get a sense of the kind of transformation that can take place in a community when we are attentive to the kind of stories that our communities tell, and how we as missional leaders impact and involve ourselves in those stories. So that's this week. I'm going to post these, post the discussion line. You've got Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday to do your discussions on these lectures. It's Thanksgiving. Take a day or two off. I understand it, but put some discussion there. Your one nugget response for this week as well. In light of your reading and in light of the discussions you're having on the discussion board. Don't forget that next Monday there is a paper due. It's your Philosophy of Missional Leadership paper that you'll need to look at, and then on that next week you're going to have that book that you're going to want to utilize. So whether it's Fitch, Faithful Presence, or Hammond and Crenshaw Sentness. Feel free to email me if you've got any questions. Looking forward to next week. God bless you and have a happy Thanksgiving.